Where I want to start, however, Ryan, at the receiver positions, is the boundary. I think this is the most interesting position battle on offense in the spring for me. So you've got multiple players are going to be in the competition for it, right? You could see Tobias Merriweather there. You could even see a scenario where Jaden Thomas plays there. I hope not. I think last year proved that he's a much better slot field guy than he is a boundary guy. I think it's going to come down to, however, Kaleb Smith, the transfer for Virginia Tech, and Deion Colzie. Now, if you look at last year, Ryan, in the games I broke down, Kaleb Smith played the vast majority of his time in the boundary. I think he can play all over, and I'd like to see him play all over. But Virginia Tech used him primarily as a boundary guy. And you know what? You get to the point where if Kaleb Smith is your starting boundary receiver, you have a pretty good football player there and a significant upgrade over what you had most of last season, because you have a guy that caught 37 passes for over 600 yards, quality route runner, great hands and concentration. I mean, he caught so many balls where it's like the quarterback last year, the kid that transferred from Marshall, was weird. He would throw some dimes and then he would just throw a bunch of, what the heck was that? But when he'd throw some dimes, or maybe Kaleb Smith made it look like a dime by how he was able to position his body. And his great body control, pretty good catch radius, not elite, but his timing as a snatch and fighting for the ball is really good. Because he doesn't get great separation, for me, but he doesn't need it. Because he's so good at contested catches. He's so good at, I call it boxing out, Ryan, on like stops and comebacks and ends, where he can kind of position himself in between the defender and the ball. He's got kind of a wide upper body, so he's not an easy guy to kind of reach around and knock the ball out of. He does a good job of extending his hands to catch the ball in those situations. So he's a really good, dependable player. And if he's your best W going into the fall, it's an upgrade over what you had, and a guy that has shown he can be a quality football player. And with a quarterback like Sam Hartman, as opposed to what he had at Virginia Tech last year, he has a chance to be a far more productive player than he was at Virginia Tech. He's not a world beater, but he's a really good, solid football player that would, to me, could be similar in production numbers, if he's the guy, to what Miles Boykin did in 2018. 50-some catches, 800-some yards, 8-9 touchdowns. I could easily see him be that kind of player, Ryan. So I think right now, if I were to say, okay, who's the leader in the clubhouse, I'm almost always going to go with the veteran, because that's just how coaches usually do it. Day one, the veteran's going to start. And so it's going to be interesting. But he's going to be battling with Deion Colzie, who is, in my opinion, easily the more talented player, but the less experienced player. That battle, to me, Ryan, is going to be really, really interesting.
Well, and it's fascinating, too, because Kaleb Smith's much more experienced football player, but he's also coming into a completely new situation, too. It's like, it's not like just like apples to apples and kind of that conversation. Like, he's a player that's coming into a new situation. He has to learn the offense. He has to do that kind of transitional stuff. And Deion is a young man that it was tough for him to begin the year last year, having the injury and coming back slowly. And during the later stretch of the season, you're like, okay, I see it now, like Deion's starting to get more confidence, because that was one thing that I wanted to see from him all year, was like, get that 6'5", 207-pound athletic wide receiver, get him confident, man, and get that competitive nature, keep working here. Because if he hits his ceiling, man, he has the potential to be special. He truly does, right? And I think that this competition is going to be really awesome to watch, because if I'm Kaleb Smith, I'm like, as a competitor, you look at Deion Colzie, you're like, wow, that kid's really good, man. He's really talented. That dude I got to bring my A game every single day. And then if you're Deion, you're like, well, that guy's good. And he's played a lot of football, so he knows what he's doing a little bit. And that's one thing that I lack right now, is that I need to still figure out what I'm doing all the time. I need to get more experience. So I feel like it's a really fascinating battle, because they are a little bit of opposites in their experience, but also one brings something to the table that the other one doesn't really have. Deion's lack of experience, and then Kaleb can look at Deion and be like, man, that needs to get my juices flowing a little bit to compete every single day as best as I can. So I think that they're going to push each other to a wide degree, and I'm excited to watch that one. That's actually one of the on both sides of the ball. That's one that I'm probably most excited to see because, like you said, Brian, there's no wrong answer there. They're both good football players. One has a higher ceiling. I think that's pretty obvious. But at the end of the day, both of those kids can make each other way better for different reasons, which is vital. And ultimately, you can get into like a little bit of a market share situation, even if they're both playing well. It's like, hey, man, we can rotate those guys a little bit. Like, it doesn't have to be just one boundary and then a clear backup. Like, maybe they both get a lot of reps. Like, you know what I mean?
Well,
It's
they're
like
both going to play, in my view, Ryan. There's no question they're both going to play. It's not a it better be that way. And I think that Chancey Stuckey is going to be that way. It's from what I heard, it's what he wanted more of last year. He just didn't get his way. And then, of course, the injury set in and it didn't matter. But if Kaleb Smith's the starter, Deion's going to play. There's no question about it. Where I'm at is I think going into the spring, I'd give Kaleb the edge from an experience standpoint. Then Deion has the talent. But here's the thing for me. If you're going to talk about, what are you rooting for? I'm rooting for them both to play well. Because to your point, if that's the 1-2 punch, you have the boundary and they're both playing at least good football, you're set at the boundary, absolutely set at the boundary, because they do have a somewhat different skill set in some areas, but there's a lot of complementary skills to them where, I think those are the things that I look at and say, hey, they're going to be good there if they both play well. But I will say this, when it comes to the boundary position, my hope, and it's a twofold wish, my hope is that Deion seizes hold of this job. Not that Kaleb doesn't play well, but Kaleb plays well. But Deion says, nope, this is my job. And here's why I say that. If Deion wins this battle, it means, number one, he's starting to tap into that full potential, number one. Number two, and that means, number one means he's going to potentially be a breakout player. Now, all of a sudden, you're going to be really good in the boundary. Number two is the more that Deion's willing to take the W, the more you can then use Kaleb Smith in other situations. Because there's some stuff like in 12 personnel, I would be prone to say if Deion's the starter at W, there's going to be times out of 12 personnel, I'm using both of them. One's at X and one's at W. Because Kaleb does bring some big boy downfield skills to the table that I think could really be effective in certain 12 personnel situations where you want to run some play action downfield shots. You got two big trees on the outside that are strong and thick. And so I think there could be situations where they play together, but I can use Kaleb Smith in a lot of different ways if Deion's my guy, my number one in the boundary, where Deion's a W. I mean, that's just kind of what he is. But if Kaleb's your one and Deion's scored or playing maybe 35 to 40% of the boundary snaps, I don't know if you can use Kaleb Smith as much around other places. So those are really the two reasons that I'm hoping that Deion Colzie ends up winning the job as far as being the guy where, okay, he seized it. Because anytime you have a position battle, Ryan, you want someone to seize it. You don't want anyone to win by default. Right. And if Deion seizes it, I think that makes the receiver core so much better and allows you to do so much more with Kaleb Smith.
Well, I was going to say that, and you just kind of hit on it a little bit, that it's the worst case scenario for me, that if Kaleb Smith wins the job because he wasn't really threatened. If Deion Colzie wasn't up to the challenge and he wasn't competitive and he just kind of shied away from that competition, like that's the worst case scenario, man. Because again, it's no shot against Kaleb Smith, talented player. And I do think that if he is the starting boundary receiver, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But for me, it's like Deion needs to play. But if Deion gets like thoroughly outplayed where you're almost looking like Kaleb Smith has to play the majority into the boundary, I think that that's a very bad sign that Deion just wasn't up for the challenge, man. Wasn't ready to take advantage of the opportunities in front of him and shied away from that challenge, And I think that for me, I want there to be heavy competition. I want Deion to put his best step forward. I want Kaleb to rise to the challenge as well. I just want those two guys to make themselves better, because if Kaleb Smith wins the job just because he's a senior, that's really a bad sign for the development of Deion Colzie, in my opinion.
It's either a bad sign for him or a bad sign for the coaching staff that they're kind of still doing the same old.
Yes.
They're just playing the veteran, and that would be a bad sign. I don't think that's going to be the case here. And so I do think that they'll play the best guy. but Deion's got to be the better guy. You don't. Here's the thing fans got to understand. You will play a guy because of his potential. You will, and you should. What you don't do is start a guy over an experienced player because of potential. At some point in time, you've got to prove yourself. And I think that's kind of where sometimes we get a little bit lost in this conversation about, where a guy, oh, this guy should play because he's so talented. Well, there's a point in time where you got to prove it to a degree, but then the flip side argument that the issue that they've had in the past in Notre Dame is, it's like, how do you prove it if you don't play him at all? Right. And so I think that's kind of where they're going to be. But if Deion doesn't compete with Kaleb Smith this spring, it's going to be very disappointing. But I expect him to. I mean, from everything I've heard, I expect him to. And I think you nailed the confidence part early, Ryan. That's the big thing with Deion. He needs to kind of have a little bit of a push. I think Deion's a kind of a quiet, really smart, intellectual kid that maybe doesn't always understand just how good he can be, but also how hard he has to push himself to get to that level. I think last year, with all the adversity he faced, was a little bit of a wake-up call for Deion, and we saw him play with a little bit more swagger late in the year. Now he's got to refine the technique, right? That's the thing that hurt him in the bowl game is he's playing against some pretty good corners, and he wasn't doing a good job getting off press and really battling for the football. That's the next step he's got to take because he was kind of the guy in the bowl game, and I didn't think he played that well. So, again, learning experience for him. Now he's got to take it to that next step.